A failed attempt to photograph reality. How foolish of me to have believed that it would be that easy. I had confused the appearances of trees and automobiles and people with reality itself, and believed that a photograph of these appearances to be a photograph of it. It is a melancholy truth that I will never be able to photograph it and can only fail. I am a reflection photographing other reflections within a reflection. To photograph reality is to photograph nothing. Photographers, of course, believe that the photograph tells them exactly what they see. There's a certain kind of truth in reality. I don't particularly believe in reality. I find reality a contradiction of experience, ultimately. So in my photographs, I like to not tell you what you already know, but to contradict you in terms of your expectations. And things are queer. Each photograph contradicts the photograph before. It presents a premise that you're looking at a bathroom, and then the next photograph shows you this giant foot in the bathroom. The contradiction comes in the size of the foot and being in the bathroom. So right away it tells you something's not quite right. The camera then in the third photograph begins to move back a little bit further, and you actually see that it's a man standing with his foot in this little bathroom, but it still doesn't make any visual sense because the scale is so peculiar and you're not quite sure what you're looking at. As the series continues, you realize that this photograph you were looking at of the man in the bathroom is actually in a book. It's a close-up of a book. And again, that photograph contradicts the photograph before. You see a big thumb in the book. Again, the camera moves back and you see it's actually a man who is standing in a passageway, and you're looking over his shoulder at this book. And eventually, the camera keeps coming back, and suddenly the photograph that you're looking at is in a frame. The camera again recedes, and you see that the frame is close to what looks to be the top of a sink in a bathroom. And then ultimately, you see that you're looking exactly at the same photograph you saw in the beginning, except that this time you notice that the little photograph in the picture. So people begin to see that the photograph, what they believed the photograph to say as being true, was always contradicted by the next photograph. And ultimately it becomes a circle. In 1965, I went to Brussels to photograph the Belgian surrealist René Magritte. I was a big fan of Magritte's and very much moved by the way his mind presented contradictions and ideas. And to me it was liberating because then I could photograph ideas, and that was essential to my growth as a photographer. This particular contact sheet is interesting to me because it has many ideas about Magritte in the photographs themselves. There are simple ones like portrait of Magritte asleep. He was, every day after he would have his lunch, he would then take a nap on the sofa. And I love the view of him asleep because so many of his pieces were really dreamlike. Another one of the photographs which I like very much is a double exposure I did outside of the house against a very textured wall. And the texture of the wall, of course, came through the image, and it was very reminiscent of those paintings he did where everything in the painting was made out of stone. But most of all, my most favorite photograph is the one of Magritte sitting at an easel, which is also a double exposure. I first photographed the easel without him being there, and he stood off to the left, and fortuitously you could see him standing in the mirror, as I did the first image. And then he sat down at the easel, and of course, being a double exposure, only those parts of him which were against dark values came through on the photograph. And because the image in the mirror was against the black wall, he is also retained there, so you see him twice. And I really love this picture because I think good portraits show you not what somebody looks like, not the geography of their face, but actually what they're about. And I think this is very symbolic of what Magritte's work was about. I wanted to do a portrait of Eva Rubinstein and her children. She was divorced and her children stayed with the husband. So I decided that she probably saw her children more in her dreams than she actually did in real life. So what I did was to take a sofa, which is a very strong horizontal line, and set it up against the window. And then I put the children around her, slightly blurred, all at different angles. So when the print is viewed directly, it seems like she's off to the side, and the children are all floating in different directions. But in fact, they are the ones who are sitting flat on the floor, and she is the one who is off in a funny direction. My version of reality considers my entire experience. It's not just observable facts that I find on the street, but it's my emotional life, my fears, my dreams, and all of these things are much more real to me than any stranger's face I might photograph. I think that one should try to photograph the essentials, and in the category of essentials, we find all of those very basic, deep emotions. When I photograph childhood things, when I photograph the ghosts of childhood, I try to get to that basic emotion that a child might feel, as I attempted to do in The Boogeyman. It's that sense of fantasy and fear and anxiety that I try to photograph, but can only fail. I had the idea of doing a photograph which was to be called The Unfortunate Man. The story behind the photograph is about a person who was not permitted to express his love by the government. And in the process, his hands become transformed. And to hide the ugliness of his hands, he begins to wear shoes on his hands. It's a very difficult thing to talk about because essentially the idea is about homosexuality and the notion that homosexual people who are not permitted, not just by law, but by society, to express themselves toward the person that they care about. The text that goes with this says words to this effect. The unfortunate man could not touch the one he loved. It had been declared illegal by the government. Slowly his fingers became toes and his hands became feet, and he began to wear shoes on his hands to hide his shame. It never occurred to him to break the law. We spend our entire lives looking into mirrors, believing the illusions reflected there, and comforted by the reality of appearances. Unfortunately, people are seldom what they appear to be, and what is seen is what we expect to see. We look for reassurance, not revelation. We do not know. I knew my mother and my father my entire lifetime, and not once did they ever reveal themselves to me. I photographed my mother, my father, and my brother in the early 60s in a little apartment on Charles Street in Manhattan. My father was about 50 and my brother was about 20, and my mother, I don't know, some age. I started out just photographing my mother and my father, but the photographs were very unhappy for me, and I began then to work with my brother in various combinations. If you knew the real secret of my family, you would find the picture I finally chose to print, the one I chose to use, is very much more revealing than it looks. Many years later, when my father died, I went back to this photograph and I wrote a text to accompanying it. The text was called A Letter from My Father, and it was based on our relationship, not what my father looked like, but about what did or did not occur between us. The text that goes with the photograph says, "A letter from my father." As long as I could remember, my father always said to me that one day he would write me a very special letter, but he never told me what the letter might be about. I used to try to guess what family secret the two of us would at last share, what mystery, what intimacy could now be revealed. I know what I had hoped to read in the letter. I wanted him to tell me where he had hidden his affection, But then he died, and the letter never did arrive, and I never found that place where he had hidden his love. I've always been fascinated with death. I think I have a very reasonable preoccupation with the subject. Most people in America certainly try to avoid the subject and pretend that we will live forever. But now that I'm 60 years old, death becomes more of a fact. I did a sequence at least 25 years ago called Death Comes to the Old Lady. And I was trying to take a photograph of what happens actually at that point of death. I used my grandmother, who was 85 at the time and died 6 months after I took this picture. And I used my father as the image of death coming to the room. This blurry shadow comes in and touches her on the shoulder. And at that moment, she disintegrates into a kind of dust. In some way, I think that this is getting near the truth of that moment of death, in the sense that we I think we rather fall into a kind of powder that floats into space and then disappears. About 1978, a French publisher offered me the opportunity to go anywhere in the world and take some photographs of my trip. I chose to go to Egypt because I think the Egyptians invented death, and because I find death so amusing and scary, it was the perfect choice. Of course, the question is, what do you do when you get to Egypt? It's very difficult to photograph places that are photographic cliches. I decided to build a pyramid because, as a boy, I always built model cities, and it seemed to be very appropriate for me to do. Of course, what I like about it best is that when you bring the camera low and close up to my pyramid, mine is much larger than theirs. Always a very important thing for a man.